May 1st, 2025. Tehran's reservoirs whispered a warning that most residents could barely comprehend. A city of over 15 million was suddenly confronting the fragility of its lifeblood. Water. Once, rivers had fed sprawling plains and aqueducts had carried the abundance across the capital. But decades of overuse, mismanagement, and relentless drought had changed that. Satellite images revealed the 5 largest reservoirs supplying Tehran were perilously low, functioning at levels that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. Before we continue, hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. City officials, facing a ticking clock measured not in days but in hours, began a quiet campaign to extend what little remained. Water pressure was reduced without fanfare. Entire districts faced nightly cutoffs, and tanker trucks became lifelines for families whose wells had run dry. Across the city, the hum of urban life persisted, but behind closed doors, residents were calculating every drop, measuring out liters for drinking, cooking, and sanitation, knowing that the day when taps ran empty was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. The crisis, however, was not confined to the capital. In Mashhad, reservoirs barely held 3% of their capacity, signaling that the issue was no longer localized. In agricultural regions, the effects were brutally tangible. Once thriving farmland withered under a sun that seemed intent on punishment. Irrigation channels ran dry, and crops rotted in the fields. Farmers, whose livelihoods depended on a predictable water supply, found themselves facing ruin, while protests ignited in provinces like Isfahan and Khuzestan. Signs and chants demanded government intervention, and for many, the frustration was intertwined with fear. The system that had once delivered life-giving water now seemed incapable of protecting them. The soils were both ancient and contemporary. Iran's climate has long been harsh, with arid zones dominating much of the landscape, but human actions amplified the danger. Groundwater was being pulled faster than it could replenish, and enormous irrigation projects, once hailed as feats of engineering, now acted as drains on a finite system. Agriculture, consuming over 90% of available water while contributing only a small fraction to GDP, became both a lifeline and a liability. Years of short-term policy choices had created a brittle infrastructure, and decades of neglect meant the country was unprepared for the climatic volatility that was steadily intensifying. As temperatures climbed and rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably, rivers that had supported generations simply vanished in places, leaving towns dependent on dwindling underground reserves. Where wells existed, the water was often brackish, forcing households to rely on private deliveries. In Tehran, the urban reality was stark. Families turned to rationing at home, children carried water from neighbors, and municipal officials plotted emergency measures that still fell short of the scale of the crisis. In this environment, even the simplest domestic task became a tactical exercise. One flush could mean deprivation for another, one wasted liter a gamble with survival. The rural impact was even more severe. Farmers, once proud of fertile lands, now walked barren fields, measuring loss in ruined harvests and mounting debts. In some regions, entire ecosystems had collapsed, with aquifers exhausted and soil eroded. Land subsidence caused buildings to shift, roads to crack, and canals to fail. Villages that had endured generations of hardship were now confronting an invisible enemy. Water scarcity. Protests multiplied, but so too did the sense of helplessness. Some communities demanded immediate government relief, while others contemplated relocation, knowing that without water, their homes would eventually become uninhabitable. Officials in Tehran recognized the looming threat and began preparing for what they called Zero Day, the moment when reservoirs could no longer supply the city's population. Measures were technical and incremental, lowering water pressure, restricting certain neighborhoods, distributing water through tankers. Yet each step was a reminder of the vulnerability beneath modern life. And while the government warned of evacuations for the most endangered districts, residents faced a more immediate concern: how to survive until help arrived. Every day the taps continued to flow, the countdown shortened, and every rainless week pushed the city closer to the edge. The international dimension added complexity. While neighboring countries and humanitarian organizations offered assistance, political realities limited the scope of cooperation. Iran's sensitivity regarding sovereignty and internal affairs meant that aid often arrived late or under restrictions, leaving officials to rely on internal solutions. Some experts argued that regional collaboration on shared water resources could provide a lifeline, but entrenched policies and mistrust slowed progress. Meanwhile, the drought deepened, heat waves grew longer, and the infrastructure continued to strain under both environmental and human pressures. At the same time, technological limitations became glaring. Reservoirs built decades ago were inefficient, dams operated below optimal levels, and water distribution networks leaked at alarming rates. Modern interventions, such as cloud seeding or desalination, were expensive, slow, or unevenly deployed. For the average Tehran resident, the immediacy of the crisis rendered abstract solutions meaningless. A family could not drink a promise of reform, only the water currently in their pipes. The city was learning that modern convenience could not replace natural abundance, and that mismanagement compounded by climate change could threaten even the largest urban centers with sudden scarcity. By mid-morning, the cracks in Tehran's system became increasingly visible. Neighborhoods reliant on older pipelines found that water pressure had dropped to a mere trickle, while newer districts fared slightly better but still faced irregular supply. Citizens began filling every available container, hoarding water as if it were currency. Supermarkets reported spikes in bottled water sales, and delivery services worked around the clock to transport supplies. Each hour without rainfall intensified the anxiety, and families developed elaborate schedules for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, attempting to stretch what little they had. The human toll extended beyond daily inconvenience. Hospitals and clinics struggled to maintain operations as sterilization and hygiene became more difficult. Schools rationed water for basic sanitation, and some suspended classes entirely in the most affected areas. The elderly, the sick, and children were particularly vulnerable, reliant on neighbors or charitable organizations to bridge the gap. Social networks, usually invisible, now became lifelines as families organized shared water collections and improvised distribution systems to survive. Outside Tehran, the agricultural collapse deepened. In provinces like Isfahan, Khuzestan, and Kerman, entire fields of wheat, barley, and vegetables lay wilted under the relentless sun. Farmers attempted desperate measures, rotating irrigation schedule, pumping remaining groundwater, or switching to drought-resistant crops. Yet for many, these efforts were too late. Harvests were lost, financial reserves depleted, and debts mounted as banks and the suppliers demanded repayment. In some cases, farmers abandoned fields entirely, knowing that the cost of sustaining crops would exceed any potential gain. The environmental consequences were equally severe. Over-extracted aquifers caused land to sink, creating fissures in roads and canals and destabilizing entire neighborhoods. Rivers that had once been lifelines now ran dry for months, leaving ecosystems without sustenance. Wildlife, dependent on streams and wetlands, faced rapid die-offs, and soil quality deteriorated under prolonged aridity. Dust storms fueled by the parched earth swept across urban and rural areas alike, compounding health risks and creating conditions that further destabilized the fragile water system. Experts pointed to decades of mismanagement as the root cause. Infrastructure had been neglected, groundwater depleted without regulation, and short-term agricultural policies had prioritized immediate yields over sustainability. Dams and reservoirs, once symbols of national ingenuity, now highlighted systemic weaknesses, unable to buffer the population against a prolonged drought. Even where modernization efforts had been attempted, progress was slow, fragmented, and often undermined by bureaucratic inertia or political disputes, leaving millions exposed to the consequences. Iran's reliance on groundwater had become particularly dangerous. Pumping exceeded natural replenishment rates, lowering water tables, and drying wells that communities had relied upon for generations. In some rural areas, entire aquifers had been exhausted, and drilling deeper wells was no longer a viable solution. The imbalance between extraction and renewal created a feedback loop. As water levels dropped, soil stability declined, crops failed, and economic pressures intensified, accelerating migration pressures toward urban centers already struggling to cope. In Tehran, the looming threat of zero day forced city planners into difficult decisions. Reservoirs were measured daily, consumption monitored hourly, and emergency measures debated around the clock. The government considered targeted evacuations, particularly for districts where infrastructure was most vulnerable. Water trucks became a primary source of survival, delivering hundreds of liters to apartment complexes and critical facilities. Yet even these efforts could not match the scale of the need. Every Every calculation, every forecast was now measured against a simple, terrifying question: how long before taps ran completely dry? Climate change amplified the crisis, making droughts longer, heat waves more severe, and rainfall patterns unpredictable. Rivers that had historically flowed year-round now experienced prolonged dry spells, leaving urban centers and agricultural zones alike vulnerable. Seasonal snowpacks in the mountains, which had traditionally replenished reservoirs and aquifers. Protests erupted across multiple provinces, fueled by both desperation and anger. Farmers, students, and ordinary citizens gathered in towns and city squares, demanding immediate government action. In some areas, protests escalated into clashes with local authorities, highlighting both the social volatility and the depth of public frustration. Residents spoke not only of scarcity, but of the loss of a basic human right: reliable access to water. Their voices, amplified by social media, painted a picture of a society under pressure, teetering on the edge of mass dislocation. Amid these pressures, the government struggled to balance immediate survival with long-term reform. Emergency measures such as water rationing and tanker distribution were implemented. Yet experts argued that these efforts addressed symptoms rather than causes. Structural reforms, upgrading pipelines, regulating groundwater extraction, modernizing irrigation, and incentivizing sustainable agricultural practices remained slow. Political constraints, resource limitations, and competing priorities all slowed meaningful action, leaving the population exposed to further shocks. By midsummer, Tehran's situation had reached an inflection point. Reservoirs were operating at near-empty levels, and authorities quietly prepared contingency plans for mass evacuations of up to 10 million residents. The specter of zero day no longer seemed distant. Every measure, from water rationing to tanker distribution, was stretched to its limits, and even minor infrastructure failures could trigger cascading crises. Families calculated daily survival, urban planners recalculated flows, and the government faced an impossible balancing act between immediate relief and strategic planning. The crisis, however, had consequences far beyond Iran's borders. For Moscow, Tehran's water emergency represented a growing complication in its regional ambitions. Russia had relied on Iranian assistance to maintain supply lines for drone and missile technology, including several key weapon systems reportedly delivered to support Moscow's operations in Ukraine. Delays or disruptions caused by Iran's internal instability could interfere with these transfers, creating vulnerabilities in Russian military logistics at a time when battlefield coordination and material support were critical. The humanitarian emergency was now intertwined with geopolitical risks. Water scarcity in Tehran did not exist in isolation. The city's factories and logistics hubs, many producing dual-use technologies, faced operational disruptions. The electrical grid and transport system, dependent on stable water for cooling and industrial processes, threatened to slow production of critical components for weapons shipments. In effect, Iran's domestic crisis had become a choke point. A failure in infrastructure or social unrest could delay or halt deliveries to Russia, constraining Moscow's capacity to replenish its arsenal or maintain its ongoing campaigns. Putin's concern, therefore, was both strategic and practical. Iran had positioned itself as a key supplier of missile systems, drones, and other equipment, and any instability that hindered production or transport would directly impact Russian operational readiness. For a state already grappling with extended supply lines and international sanctions, the prospect of a critical part suffering domestic disruption was deeply troubling. In a conflict where timing, precision, and sustained logistics determine outcomes, a disrupted supply chain could erode advantages painstakingly built over months. On the ground, the water crisis heightened the likelihood of social unrest, further amplifying the risk to weapons delivery. Protests in Tehran, Mashhad, and Isfahan increasingly threatened industrial districts and transport corridors. Roads leading to key airports and rail hubs became sites of tension, with civilians demanding access to water and protesting shortages. Any closure or disruption of these routes could prevent weapon components from leaving Iran entirely or delay delivery to Russian fronts. Analysts noted that even a partial breakdown in movement could cascade, causing shortages at critical moments in military operations. Iran's government, aware of the state stakes, walked a precarious line. Emergency measures to address the population's needs were vital to maintain internal stability, yet these same measures risked slowing industrial output and transport efficiency. Officials faced a dual challenge: prevent mass displacement, ensure water for urban centers, and at the same time sustain critical production lines feeding military exports. The window for effective management was narrow, and the margin for error minimal. Tehran's drought, in essence, had become a geopolitical lever that Moscow could not control. Meanwhile, the perception of instability carried strategic weight. Russian planners knew that international observers were monitoring both Tehran's domestic situation and the supply chain for military equipment. Any indication that Iran could not guarantee production or transport could embolden opposition forces, complicate regional alliances, and even affect Moscow's calculations on engagement tempo in Ukraine. What might seem like a local environmental crisis was, in reality, a multiplier of risk for a nation relying on precise coordination and uninterrupted supply. Every missed delivery, every delayed shipment of drones, missiles, or precision components became a tangible problem on the battlefield. Analysts began to frame Iran's water crisis as not only a humanitarian emergency, but a potential operational constraint for Russia, a situation where climate, mismanagement, and human need intersected with international conflict. The consequences were stark. 10 million residents faced possible evacuation, critical infrastructure teetered on collapse, and agricultural zones were already in ruins. Weapons production and supply chains faced interruptions, and Moscow, dependent on Iran for resupply, had to account for factors entirely outside its control. The zero-day scenario in Tehran was not simply a domestic emergency. It was a strategic vulnerability, one that could delay or degrade military operations thousands of kilometers away. In a world where logistics determined the speed and outcome of conflicts, even a natural disaster could become a weapon, reshaping the balance of power through disruption alone. Tehran's water crisis, therefore, illustrates a simple but profound reality. Domestic instability in one nation can reverberate across global strategic calculations. For Putin, the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in Iran represents a threat not from armies or sanctions, but from nature and mismanagement, a scenario where diplomacy, logistics, and environmental realities collide. The drought that threatens millions of civilians also imperils the delivery of drones and weapons that Russia counts on, making Iran's zero-day one of the most significant concerns Moscow faces in the coming months. In the end, the story is both immediate and ongoing. Water scarcity, industrial disruption, social unrest, and geopolitical risk converge in Tehran, creating a situation that could redefine the strategic landscape of the region. The clock ticks not only for the residents of Iran, but for foreign powers relying on its cooperation and stability. What happens in the reservoirs, canals, and parched fields of Iran will ripple far beyond its borders, a reminder that environmental crises can become instruments of consequence in the theater of international conflict, and that a lack of water in one city can threaten the operational plans of a distant army.